I am Evan Sandhaus, and I would like to talk to you today about the future of the past, specifically as told through the lens of the New York Times archive. Just some quick preliminaries. I work at the New York Times, perhaps the finest English language newspaper in existence. And at the New York Times, I run the teams that are responsible for search, archives, and the metadata that powers both of those things. And the work I'm going to talk about today was really the product of a lot of really smart people. So I don't want to stand up here and have you all think that this is a solo act. It certainly isn't. But in working on the archives, and I've worked at the New York Times for about 8 years, and the archives have really been part of my work that entire time. And in working on the archives over the last 8 years, it began to strike me that our relationship with the past has started to change. Traditionally, we've connected to the past primarily through expert distillation of primary source material. And that is because in earlier eras, it was highly impractical and potentially cost prohibitive to provide complete archives to the general public. So information scarcity necessitated that we rely on experts to mine archives on our behalf. And I could think of no better example of this phenomenon than the Greatest Hits album. Because basically you have this, for every artist, you have a back catalog, but we have to rely on an expert to mediate our experience with that back catalog because it wasn't affordable to bring the whole back catalog home with you and study it. And the Greatest Hits album isn't just particular to the record industry. We did it at the New York Times too. Here is 300 of the most influential front pages we ever produced, available in bound form from your local bookseller. Our complete coverage of World War II, or our complete coverage of the Civil War. But things have started to change. Twin revolutions in both communications technology and computing are beginning to completely transform the way we relate to our own past. And for the first time, really ever, it's possible to provide non-experts with ongoing and economic access to entire archives. So now, were you so inclined to spend the next 24 hours and 56 minutes listening to the Scorpions, Spotify gives you that power. But more generally, as was discussed in the previous session, Spotify puts about 20 million songs, or about 115 years of content at your disposal to find the gems for yourself. And at the New York Times, on April 2nd of this year, we undertook a similar initiative when we relaunched our Times Machine now with 129 complete years of the New York Times archive between 1851 and 1980 available online to any of our subscribers. Unfortunately, through this process, we learned that making a success of your online archive isn't just simply a matter of getting the content digitized and uploading it to a publicly accessible web server. It turns out that it's harder than that. And through our experience turning this giant pile of newspapers into something compelling for our users, I came to the conclusion that there are really three things that you need to be thinking about when you put your archive online in order to make it the most engaging and impactful experience you possibly can for your audience. And the first of these is distribution. The fact of the matter is that if you don't have a channel through which to deliver your content to your audience in a compelling way, you basically are going to continue to be stuck at square one. So distribution is key. As well as discovery. When you have a giant archive, you need to find a mechanism to empower your users to find the things in it that they will find compelling. And lastly, though we may be getting past the era of the greatest hits record, it's still important to work on your users' behalf to surface gems in your archive, because most of your users are not going to have the time or the inclination to spend every day, all day, trolling through your archives for the gems. So you need to provide some way of helping them find the good stuff. So for the rest of my talk today, I want to talk about how at the New York Times we've approached these three, what I'm calling pillars of a successful online archive. I'm going to talk about our Times Machine browser, our enhanced archive search that we recently launched, and our at MIT Archives Twitter feed, which if you're not following already, well, I think you should. So But first, before I dive into the specifics of our archive strategy, I wanted to introduce you to the New York Times Archive. The New York Times Archive was born on September 18th, 1851, with this, the first edition of the New York Times. This is half of it. It was 4 pages long. And you noticed a lot has changed. We don't use the word daily anymore. And we also don't have a hyphen in between New and York. And since then, we've published about 59,000 complete issues of the newspaper. And when we think about our archive internally, we tend to think of it in 2 separate periods, the deep archive and the modern archive. And the primary difference between these 2 portions of our archive is that from the modern archive, which starts in 1981 going forward, we have digital text for all of our stories that is display quality. So we can take those articles, put them in a traditional web template, and have you experience them like web native content. Before that, we have scans, but we don't have display quality text. So we had to figure out a way to bring that content to you in a more compelling way. And to put some numbers around it, that period of content where we only have scans and bad OCR and a few other things that I'm going to detail in a second, that's 46,592 issues of our archive. Or, if you prefer, 2.3 million pages or 11,298,000 articles. And this number right here represents about 75% of the articles the New York Times has created during its life, which are not available online as text. And let me tell you what we do have for this stuff in our deep archive. We have high-resolution scans of every page between 1980 all the way back to 1851. We have information that tells us where on those pages specific articles appear. And for each of these articles, we have a headline, we have a lead paragraph that's clean and beautiful that you can show to people, and we have what we like to call dirty ASCII. It's the stuff that we got from the OCR scans of the document, and it's riddled with errors. You can't show it to anybody. It is good enough to build a search index over, though. And we have indexing metadata, which is super cool. I'm going to prattle on about that at some length in a second. But the indexing metadata gives us topical subject headings, essentially, for almost all of the articles in our archive. So now that you've met the archive, let me talk to you about the distribution channel we built for it. Because I really do think distribution is the cornerstone of any successful online archive strategy, but it needs to be compelling. The Times Archive has been online in some form for nearly a decade. But until recently, the technology available to us didn't permit us to show the archive to our users in the most engaging way. In fact, I can think of no better way of illustrating sort of the evolution of our archive experience than to tell you the story of John Fairfax. Who here has heard of John Fairfax? Oh, you're in for a treat. John Fairfax was the first person to row across the Atlantic by himself. He was British. He arrived in America after the journey on July 20th or July 19th, 1969. And that's probably the most boring thing he ever did, as I learned by reading his 2012 obituary, from which I will share you a couple of selections. At 9, he settled a dispute with a pistol. At 13, he lit out for the Amazon jungle. At 20, he attempted suicide by jaguar. Afterwards, he was apprenticed to a pirate. Basically, this guy was the role model for the most interesting man in the world. And after reading this obituary, I thought to myself, well, I got to learn more about this guy. So this was a couple of years ago, before we'd launched our new archive browser. And the way that you got into our archive back then was that you found the archive landing page for the specific story that you wanted to read, which looks like this. And if you were sufficiently compelled by what you found there, you click through, and you could see a PDF of a single article detailing the story with the contents of the one story that you are interested to read. And I'm not knocking this experience. This is really probably the best we could have done with the technology available at the time, but there are 2 problems with it. One is context. Newspapers were not created with the idea that they were going to be cut up in individual articles and presented separately. A newspaper is an entire editorial artifact, and the context of the relationship between the articles and the advertisements matters a lot. And secondly, the PDF in a browser or in a separate application is not really the most compelling user experience. You're not on the site, you don't have our navigation, you don't have other articles you can click to, and you don't have any advertisement that you can see. So those are 2 real problems with this approach to surfacing archives. So we decided to redesign the archive experience to bring in the context of the complete issue. And I'm going to show you now that issue about John Fairfax, if the AV gods are smiling on me today. So let me just pull that up. On Swedish keyboards, it turns out that the slash is in an unexpected place. Here we go. And let's see. Oh, good. I'm on a special network. Hopefully this will be fast enough to load. It does not appear as though it wants to load. So I will show you the slide version of what I was going to say. So the Times Machine experience basically takes complete issues of the newspaper and brings them into a browser, and we use the same technology that you might find in an online map. These images are draggable, zoomable, you can click on them to highlight articles, and you can see the entire context of the newspaper. And you can see from this screen grab of the issue that the crossing by John Fairfax of the Atlantic was front page news that day, but it really wasn't the main story. The main story was that two men were about to walk on the moon, and that was our lead. And underneath that, there was a story about Senator Ted Kennedy and a car accident he had been involved in Massachusetts involving, unfortunately, the death of a young woman who was his traveling companion. And this kind of thing, this seeing the entire newspaper in context, is really a critical thing to bring to people, because when we think of history, we tend to forget simultaneity, but the world happens all at once. Like, these three things happened on the same day, and if you're looking at articles in isolation, you're not going to see that. And also, the ads are super cool. The articles tell you what happened, but the ads tell you how people lived. And one of my favorite ads in the entire archive is on page 110 of this issue. It is an ad for an Aquarian music festival to be held about 3 weeks later. And if you look at the lineup here, it's going to be in Woodstock, New York. It looks like they have some pretty good bands. It might be worth checking out. So when we launched Times Machine, we launched with just the features that I showed you, because it was more important to get something out there quickly that was good than to wait forever and get something out there that was perfect. But recently, we've introduced the other two things, discovery and curation. And fortunately, when we started to work on discovery, we kind of had a proud tradition to build on, because the Times has been thinking about how to make it easy to find things in our archives for 101 years. Because 101 years ago, they launched this, the New York Times Index. It was a bound volume that was basically your guide to finding the stuff you were interested in our archives, which were first distributed as bound rag paper copies of the newspaper, later as microfilm, and even later online. But the idea behind the index never changed. It was an annual book that listed all of the subjects that were covered by the newspaper that year and followed each subject heading with a summary of each article that was about that particular subject in that year. So if you wanted to read about the Declaration of Independence in 2007, that was the article about it. And you could go to the microfilm or the computer or the rag paper bound copy and find the thing you were looking for. So we knew that when we were building search into Times Machine, we absolutely had to build on the index. But we also knew that the index, while important, wasn't entirely sufficient. Oh, good. The AV gods have smiled on me. So here is Times Machine. Let's blow it up. So as I was saying, it is a complete replica of the newspaper that is draggable, zoomable, and all the articles can be clicked so that you can select them and read them. And we just built search into the archive. So let me use some of that index knowledge. Let's search for Gone. Let's search for Gone with the Wind. So I'm selecting that from the drop-down, and that selects the tag from our index for Gone with the Wind. And if I search, these are all of the articles in the New York Times that were about Gone with the Wind. And we thought it was really important in this search to show you a preview of the page you were going to, because that, more than anything else, communicates to you what you can expect to read when you get there. And we also incorporated keyword search. So if the 91 results here are a little overwhelming, you can refine it. I totally am making this up. I've never tried this before. Seriously. Add Malmo to this query. Oh, there's one article about it. What is this about? Well, while it's loading, I can tell you this article I found was from 1949. And apparently there was a currency dispute with the film distributors and Denmark. And so Gone with the Wind wasn't showing in Copenhagen. So this is an article that we're loading here about how all the folks in Denmark were coming over to Malmö and putting a strain on the city's resources so they could see Gone with the Wind. And these are the sort of, there it is. These are the sort of gems that a Discovery feature lets you unearth inside of a newspaper archive. So that is our approach to Discovery. Where is my cursor? Where is the presentation? And lastly, we decided, in addition to providing you with the ability to do Discovery, we needed to do some degree of curation on this archive. Because after all, it's 11 million articles. That's an awful lot to expect people to have to file through to find the gems every single day. So we decided to launch our new Twitter feed at NYT Archives. You should totally follow it. It's amazing. To, on a daily basis, go through our archive and find interesting and relevant materials to share with our global audience. And we sort of find that most of the stuff that we dig up in the archive falls into 4 general categories that are probably true of most news archives and probably have some general relevance to other kinds of archives that you would want to put online. We tend to share things that provide context to current affairs. We love to commemorate anniversaries. The ads are amazing. And we like to share the occasional crazy thing that we find in the archive as well. And to give you a couple of examples, in terms of providing context to current affairs, a few weeks ago, we dug up this article. It was the first time we found the word Ebola in the New York Times archive. And it turns out this is the article about how scientists decided to rename the extremely well-named green monkey fever to be Ebola after a river in the country then known as Zaire, where the disease first occurred in 1976. Also, as you, I'm sure all know, Lauren Bacall recently passed away, and we dug up this incredible quote from our archive to commemorate her passing, and we wanted to share that with our global audience. And I think it hardly bears elaboration why this bears on today's news. It turns out that in 1958, there was a revolution in Iraq that overthrew a pro-Western government. And providing these kind of contextual clues, I think, helps people get a better sense of how what's happening today is grounded in what's happening in the past. But, of course, there are also anniversaries. And sadly, the issue of August 7th was the 64th anniversary of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima. And sharing this, I think, is important to help people understand that it wasn't just a story you read in books, but it was a reality for people who were living through it. Also, on a somewhat lighter note, about 160 years ago, Henry David Thoreau published Walden Pond. And we dug up the original NYT review for it, and I have to share with you my favorite quote from that, which is, "As a contribution to the comic literature of America, Walden is worthy of some attention, but in no other respect." We don't always get it right. And also, there are incredible advertisements in our archive. I dug up this ad right here for office space for lease in One Times Square, a building you probably know better as the Jumbotron encrusted tower from which they drop the ball on New Year's Eve. But it was the original Times Square headquarters of the New York Times. And this was an ad that ran about 110 years ago when the building was opening, trying to attract tenants to move in. And we do find wacky stuff in the archive that, we need to share with people. This was a quote from an article in the 60s about New Yorkers' frustration with slow tourists. Some things are timeless. This is a brutal review of some play that has since been forgotten, called Apartment 12K, which was quite vacant. I love the subhead. "The flashes of ingenuity are so rare that the finish, while unexpected, is also welcome." And this is one of my favorite articles. I found this one by Googling my wife's last name. And this is an article about a refrigerator repairman in 1960 who found himself trapped in the walk-in refrigerator of a bar and was losing oxygen and started to panic. He's like stuck in the fridge, and he had the brilliant idea of unplugging all of the taps. which caused the bartender to go downstairs to see what was going on, found this passed out guy in the fridge, and the story ends with the bartender inviting him to come back to the bar from the hospital for a free beer. So is this curation approach working in our archive? Well, I'm happy to share with you that since we launched this feed, in the 8 days after we launched it, as compared to the 8 days before we launched it, traffic to the archive is up approximately 300%. So we think it's really important to provide some level of curation in order to draw people into this older content. And perhaps my favorite indication that it's working is this gentleman who, I swear, I just found this. This is not a plant. This guy said, the Times Machine might be worth a subscription to the New York Times alone. And I couldn't agree with that sentiment more. So, in conclusion, the Times Machine is a response to the shifting dynamics of our relationship with the past. And those dynamics have shifted because it's possible to give all of the stuff in an archive to a person online now in a way that it's never been before. But if you're going to do that, you have to be mindful of the distribution channel, you have to provide good discoverability features, and you have to provide curation to help draw them into the gold in your archive. So with that, I want to thank you so much and encourage you to follow NYT Archives on Twitter.